And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage born free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at, well, coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the original mothership at coalitionradio.us, where nearly eight years of interviews can be found, ranging on every subject from presidential campaigns, well, to an issue that we're going to discuss tonight, which of course is the ongoing efforts to decriminalize sex work, to bring, if you will, sex work out of the shadows for which it has been placed by our government and by our society, and recognize it that it's a normal extension, a consensual extension of human relationships. Joining us tonight is a representative of an organization that's been on many times. In the past, we've had Alex Andrews on. She is, of course, the director of SWOP Behind Bars. Joining me tonight is Blair. She is the deputy director of SWOP Behind Bars, and she's the host of their podcast, All in a Day's Sex Work. Blair, welcome to the Coalition for the very first time.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, so we haven't had folks from your org on in a few months, really, since the very start of the plague, as we call it here. So what I'd love if you could do, because there'll be people who will learn about your organization for the first time as we broadcast this live tonight and in the future, give us some background on how SWOP Behind Bars came to be, what your original goals were, and what the organization has truly blossomed into.
So SWOP Behind Bars has been around for a while. It was started by Alex Andrews and her colleague, Jill McCracken. And they set out just to offer resources to current and formerly incarcerated sex workers using a harm reduction framework. And that is still the core of our mission. So since then, it has just blossomed into a really vibrant coalitional effort to continue to bring resources to current and formerly incarcerated sex workers. And we have actually gone on to be able to fiscally sponsor a lot of smaller grassroots organizations, and have gotten to have the privilege of being involved in this rapidly growing movement of people around the country. It's really great.
So I go back a few years now, having interviewed folks from your org before. In the very beginning, it literally, from my perspective, started out simply enough, and elegantly enough, I might add, as letter writing in support of folks who are incarcerated, sending them basic supplies, toiletries, books. That was a big part of the initial outreach, and also a burgeoning effort to provide them with some career advice and lifestyle advice, and just in addition to all of that, being a friendly voice, if you will, in the darkness of a supporting role in folks' lives who were thrown into chaos by the criminalization and ultimately the incarceration that occurred. What do you, from your perspective now, what have you grown into, and how important is it that you folks maintain this sort of vigil? I'd love to touch on this during the show, some of the ongoing challenges of criminalization and incarceration. What happens to these folks in jail? What opportunities are given? So just sort of give us the broad picture. There is.
The laws around getting packages into prisons and jails can be complicated, but what we've found is Amazon is the most effective way to get those things in without getting rejected. Now we actually run over 700 wish lists, and we host those. We try to put a couple up per week on our Instagram. They get really, really good support. These folks get their wish lists filled, and that's incredibly helpful in them feeling supported, and also just to pass the time, man, because prison is boring. So we also do an annual drive for fundraisers for correspondence courses for incarcerated sex workers. And that program started in, I want to say it was 2019. We did like 5, and now we're doing 21. So we've seen tremendous growth there. And we have a 100% completion rate of those correspondence courses. It's mostly like paralegal courses and things like that. So anything that we can do to help people feel supported and not forgotten about while they're incarcerated. And we actually have some folks who are doing pretty long bids, because we have women who get caught up in federal anti-trafficking stings, which we should talk about at some length later, how, actual victims of and survivors of trafficking can get caught up and incarcerated for long stretches of time as a result of the way that these laws are written. So the ability for those people to funnel their time and energy and the stillness of incarceration into something that might help them with reentry is hugely important. Upon reentry, we do a lot of post-release support. So we will get people cell phones, smartphones. We'll help them with financial literacy classes. We'll help connect them with housing resources and things like that.
There are, across, if you will, the political spectrum, literally thousands of organizations that purport to be, and the important word is purport, to be supportive and caring for and caring on behalf of, and, if you will, organizing on behalf of folks who are sex workers. An enormous amount of government money goes into a lot of these. Yet, I don't see many of these organizations really providing much other than the way of, if you will, additional politicking and or very often making a point literally on the backs of these individuals. There is so much federal money out there. Where is it all going? What are they using it for?
Well, I can't speak to that. I haven't seen their payroll sheets. I've only seen ours. But you know how that goes. I think that the fatal flaw of a lot of these anti-trafficking orgs and even some of the direct prison outreach organizations is that I don't see a lot of them meeting people where they are at, right? So, and I don't see a lot of them asking people what they feel their needs are. And that's hugely problematic in any industry, to be writing legislation or offering services based on one's own assumptions of what a population needs. You have to engage your target demographic in the solutions that you're trying to bring to their table. One thing that SWOP Behind Bars does differently is that we work really, really hard to cultivate leadership within the populations that we serve and elevate those voices. So we want to get, women who have been arrested for prostitution, and men, and specifically trans folks, and specifically, trans people of color who have done sex work and been incarcerated, to put them in positions of community leadership where they can really shine with their natural talents. And sex workers are great organizers because they're very good with people. We want to get those people in front of committees and hearings and advocating for themselves and empowering them to do so. And that's something I don't see a lot of in the broader landscape of organizations that purport to cater to those populations.
Right. So effectively, you folks are out there feeling really, I'll call it partially humanitarian, but also just sort of fulfilling the day-to-day needs of community members who find themselves incarcerated, as opposed to sort of that big picture, we're going to advocate on behalf of sex workers without really understanding what their needs are and actually what their desires or what their decisions are based on. It's an astonishing mission, really, and yet there are so many federal laws that essentially have been designed to fly in your face. You know, we're a couple of years removed from FOSTA and Sesta, and for folks who aren't familiar with them, they essentially criminalized electronic communications between people involved in commercial sex work, if you will, without taking the time to differentiate between, if you will, consensual and non-consensual work, branding everything that involves sex with the word trafficking, sort of the T becoming the scarlet letter, if you will, of folks involved in sex work, despite the fact that it may be very well be their lifestyle decision to do so, or it may be a decision that makes economic sense for them to do so. How much now, 2 years out or so, has this federal legislation impacted your ability to, well, to cater to your flock, for lack of a better term?
It's made it a lot more difficult. So FOSTA and Sesta, or the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, the premise of it is unconstitutional, and that's currently being challenged by the Woodhull Freedom Foundation with the help of Walter's Law Group, because it undercuts Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is something that's getting a lot of attention right now, for other political reasons. And it also has a tremendous cooling effect on free speech on the internet. Basically, Section 230 is the part of the Communications Decency Act that was upheld and maintains that platforms are not criminally or civilly liable for communications held on those platforms. So, if I, call you a name on Twitter, you can't sue Twitter for me having called you a name on Twitter, right? Mm-hmm. And so because of Sesta and FOSTA, the moderators of these message boards and these online platforms can be held criminally and legally, civilly responsible for any content that can be seen as facilitating or enabling sex trafficking. So the effect that this has on the work that we do is that it makes harm reduction extremely tenuous, because anything that you will promote online as the harm reduction strategy pertaining to sex work could be construed as enabling, and that can put you at risk. It also makes sex work more dangerous for sex workers, which makes our jobs harder because our job is to help people be safe.
I mean, the first victims, if you will, the first casualties of FOSTA Sesta were the review sites, weren't they? I mean, and a lot of the sites that enabled screening, if you will, by folks who were providing the service in order to screen their potential customers. Are we still in that same terrible place with that?
Yeah, unfortunately, after FOSTA and Sesta, Craigslist pulled all of their personals ads, and this is a good demonstration of the way in which legislation that affects sex workers will eventually come for the main populace. But also, yeah, the review boards were all taken down on Reddit, and also the boards that were up specifically for sex workers to talk about safety, about bad dates and things like that. And that's had a tremendous impact as well.
So, of course, then we bring forward the rest of the, if you will, federal legislation that can impact the daily lives of sex workers. And why? I mean, first of all, let's give sort of a little lesson. I'll call it lesson 101. Why do sex workers prefer decriminalization as opposed to full legalization? As a libertarian, our gut reaction is always to go for full legalization. What's the difference and why is it important?
Well, there are a lot of reasons for that. I think first and foremost, it's a little reactionary in that sex workers are not at a place where they're really that interested in having the government be all up in their business, but in the opposite direction, right? So with legalization comes a tremendous amount of regulation. And as we've seen, with that pertaining to marijuana, for example, there's a lot of bureaucracy. There are a lot of, it can be rather Byzantine and arbitrary, some of these regulations. There's often not a lot of consistency across jurisdictions about what those regulations are. So legalization doesn't really do much to help with the restriction of business and movement and free market that a lot of sex workers really value. It doesn't do more than criminalization does to free up that business model. Additionally, legalization presents a lot of barriers to entry. So if you take a look at some of the legal and regulated forms of sex work, like stripping, for example, there are jurisdictions where people have to have really expensive annual licenses or, pay house fees to clubs that make it really difficult to stay above board, and ends up putting people at risk of running afoul of the law just in different ways.
Now, on top of that, of course, you've got the and I'll call it the government enforced societal shame factor. What type of impact does, in fact, participation in sex work, particularly if you've been incarcerated, have on your ability to obtain some of the very services one would need to, by their definition, by the nanny state's definition, remove themselves from sex work? And I'm talking about subsidized housing. I'm talking about, aid to children, the relationship between the government and individual and their children. What challenges does this present to them?
So this has been something I've been hammering on lately, which is that we tend to, and I don't know why this is or where it came from, but we tend to think of interaction with the criminal legal system if the outcome is not, like life in prison or the death penalty, if it's like anything short of the death penalty, as being a triumph, kind of in the way that when I was a kid, I thought that anything that wasn't McDonald's was healthy, right? Mm-hmm. So, but the fact of the matter is that any interaction with the criminal legal system can be deeply traumatizing and is inherently deeply disruptive. So, let's just take it with a simple prostitution charge, okay? A misdemeanor, released on your own recognizance, first-time offense. And you say you get arrested on a Friday night, so you don't have your first appearance and you can't get bonded out until Monday. Well, what if you also have a straight job? What if you also have a civilian job and you were supposed to be there on Saturday afternoon and now you've lost that job? That's really financially disruptive. What if you having a job, an hourly job is the difference between you having housing and not having housing? What if you being able to prove your employment is the difference between you getting to keep your kids or not keep your kids? There are instances where social services are called in to situations because of a prostitution arrest, and that can result in the separation of families. Additionally, a criminal record, even a very minor one, follows you for the rest of your life. So Alex may have told you this story, but we have someone in our organization who had a small smattering of arrests in the early 90s. And like 5 years ago, when they were trying to buy their condo, they had to delay their closing while they tried to sue the homeowners association because right before closing, they found these old arrests and tried to deny them buying the condo. It can complicate international travel to have old arrests on your record, depending on the country that you're going into. I mean, even one night in jail can have humongous, immediate and long-term consequences.
Wow. The Nordic model. Explain for folks who are, involving themselves in this issue for the first time. What is the Nordic model?
So the Nordic model is also known as end demand. Um, and it's like a partial decriminalization. In fact, that's another thing that they're calling it here now, is partial decrim. And the focus then goes from incarcerating sex workers to incarcerating customers, which already happens under criminalization, right? The only functional difference is that instead of painting sex workers as like dangerous criminals, it is choosing the other narrative where they're hapless victims who are being victimized by these terrible pervy men. And so they're both incomplete and problematic narratives. Neither of those, criminalization or partial decriminalization or the Nordic model, actually allow sex workers any agency. And for anybody who's interested in the rights of men as full citizens of this country, you would think they would be much more up in arms about how disruptive that same kind of interaction with the criminal legal system can be for men who may or may not be the breadwinners of their family, who may be having some of the same challenges around custodial battles. In fact, here in Florida, this year, it went into effect on January 1st. There is something called the Solicitation for Prostitution Public Database, and it is functionally a specialized sex offender registry. So now, as of January 1st in Florida, if you are arrested for solicitation of prostitution, you will end up on this registry for a minimum of 5 years.
Right.
And that's something that is going to put your life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in immediate and long-term jeopardy.
I've got to ask you, what do folks hope to gain with all of this? Besides the obvious cliched response about being the oldest profession and all that nonsense, sexuality is such, besides being an important part of our lives, such a ubiquitous part of our lives. I mean, it's everywhere and anywhere. Why, in the year 2021, as educated as we all purported to be, as we've made so many gains in other parts of our relationships, whether it be understanding bullying, for example, understanding that people learn differently, understanding that people process information differently. Why is sexuality the last battleground, and why have we decided to declare war on sex workers?
I can't say it better than Dan Savage has been saying it for years, which is that Canada got the French, or Europe got the French, Australia got the convicts, and America got the Puritans. Yeah. I mean, this is we've been waging this battle for a long time. And you'd think that we would have more, pressing issues at hand here in this country, but apparently not.
Because at every turn, I've seen folks, and I guess I would consider myself an ally. Just that we've spent a fair amount of time on this show interviewing folks from different perspectives within this controversy, this challenge. At every turn, I've found that the people most responsible, most engaged in ending trafficking have been people, by and large, in the sex worker community themselves, and organizations within the sex worker community themselves, both from just simply being human beings, and number two, being involved in a milieu that allows oneself to see more clearly these things occurring, as opposed to this clumsy, haphazard, civil liberties, civil rights denying legal system that we pretend to put on stage. Am I wrong there? Am I overstating the case?
I don't think you are overstating the case. No, and it's funny because it's not a partisan issue either, right? And that's a place where I think the debate can really go sideways. For every kind of conservative leaning reaction to something like sex work, there is an equal and opposite leftist reaction, and both are misguided. Right. Unless the time, like where the sensibility lies is in the middle, where you're letting consenting adults do what whatever it is that consenting adults want to do with their own bodies.
Mm-hmm. And yet we're a society that has placed a premium in this current generation, being, I'll just say mine, I'm older than you obviously, but moving forward to your generation, there's been a bodily autonomy and choice have never been higher, yet those very same folks who advocate for choice and body autonomy and self-ownership very often are the first, again, to label people, individual within the sex worker community as being victims, as being hapless, as being only worthy of scorn / pity, for lack of a better term. Do you see that as well? And do you see that as hypocritical?
I see it as I see it as short-sighted. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very short-sighted, and I think that it is a human impulse to project our personal narratives onto people around us. So if the way that I would react to something, like, it's just hard to think in a pluralistic mindset. And I don't think that people are very good about it. And I think that there's really deep polarization in our country right now that further facilitates that kind of constant, like, upping the stakes reactionaryism. Mm-hmm. So in particular, there's some pretty toxic, what started out really well-intentioned and progressive, but has kind of become a little toxic, discussion about the role of men in sex work, both as sex workers and as clients. And, if you paint all patrons of sex workers as dangerous criminals, first of all, you're discouraging or frightening men who might be good clients and only leaving the high-risk ones who don't either have anything to lose or care how they're perceived, and that's more dangerous for sex workers. You're not leaving any space for the male contingency that wants to be in allyship and advocacy, and that's problematic. And I think that, most sex workers don't hate men, don't feel necessarily victimized by all men, and we should probably do a better job of allowing the people that want to advocate for us to do so, as long as they're requisitely passing the mic along.
Isn't the entire irony of this situation, and it's a brutal irony, it's a deadly irony, it's an irony soaked in blood, if you will, because people are dying, that the very intent of these laws, these regulations, these societal norms that are being inflicted on people have the exact unintended effect that, in fact, they've introduced shame into a formula. They've discouraged any sort of normalcy in terms of commercially based mutual sexual connections. They've made it perversely far more dangerous by driving it underground into the type of environment that every attempt at prohibition yields. We saw it in alcohol. We certainly see it in drugs with narcoterrorism and the destruction of our inner cities. And now with sex work, whether it be from folks who are engaged in dancing to OnlyFans to folks who are escorts, we've simply made it more dangerous because, number one, as you mentioned, the people involved who are willing to flout these norms are still there, and equally as importantly, the danger level associated with slimming down has left women brutally unempowered, particularly women, particularly trans folks, who now have to look towards a criminal element, if you will, for air quotes protection. Again, I guess I'm just trying to understand. It seems like everything they've done has had a perverse counter effect. Have they accomplished anything?
There's a real kind of cognitive dissonance to the rescue paradigm. right? Because, again, who's asking people if they want to be rescued, and who's asking them what being rescued looks like? I mean, do you expect these women and men and non-binary folks to go work at Starbucks? Do you think that they will face less labor exploitation in another area of capitalism? I mean, I don't know. I don't know who thinks that. I mean, I've had some pretty exploitative jobs in my life, and all of them were hourly wage. Now, I think that if we were to focus less on people's individual adult consensual behaviors and focus more on improving the institutions that we have to work around and within, we would have more success, right? So if the issue is not sexual labor, the issue is labor exploitation. The issue isn't trafficking. The issue is more often than not domestic violence. And we're not running around out here taking domestic violence survivors very seriously in our culture. Right. So maybe if we did some more of that, we'd have some better results.
All of this, of course, brings us to the, talking about an event which is irony laden. I guess irony is the word for tonight. We're talking about the Super Bowl. And on one hand, the Super Bowl represents an opportunity for America's finest football teams to engage in conflict on the field of football battle, with the ultimate victor being triumphant over the land. While simultaneously, it seems it also means an attempt every year to whitewash the respective host city, wherever they happen to be in America, from acknowledging that adult entertainment even exists, simultaneously pointing out just how important sexuality and adult entertainment is to the very sport part and parcel of it all is. I mean, it's kind of funny if it wasn't so tragic.
Well, nobody ever gets sexual at the halftime show, so that's...
Yeah. Wow. Good point. So it strikes me that every year at about this time, maybe a couple weeks beforehand, because you can't wait till the night before, right? You have this much hyped influx of folks who work in the adult entertainment community, followed simultaneously by a much hyped incursion police state-like environment surrounding it, so we can promote this artificial sense of, I don't know, Americana? What's going on here?
Every time I open my Google alerts for like a full month before the Super Bowl, I feel like I'm going to have a stroke. I'm like, oh God. So like today I was checking and the first thing I see is like, coalition raises awareness about human trafficking in Tampa ahead of the Super Bowl. And there's like 30 stories like this. And, and then also nationwide around the Super Bowl in cities where it's not being hosted, law enforcement will ramp up stings. It defies logic to me. And in fact, my answer to, the Super Bowl sex trafficking question is like, you have to apply logistics to this situation, because if you start applying logistics to the allegation that like hundreds of thousands of people are trafficked into Tampa Bay ahead of the Super Bowl, the whole thing falls apart.
Right.
Like, who is bringing these women here? How? Where are they keeping them? How many customers are there? How is that still the case in COVID? It's pretty hard to get a room in the host city of the Super Bowl that weekend, and they're really, really expensive. And anybody who has the, wherewithal to run, a human trafficking ring would probably be aware that there's a really significantly heightened law enforcement presence in the host city, and might think that there was like a better place they could be taking their huge, cavalcades of trafficked women for any given weekend. It just, once you start applying logistics to the situation, it completely falls apart.
Right. But yet they still do it every year. I mean, your organization issued a press release just the other day, and we posted it on the Coalition Media Assets, talking about the step up in arrests, the suspension, if you will, of normal due process. It seems like all of this for a football game. What is happening specifically this year in Florida with the hometown team and Tom Brady and all that other stuff? What pursuits in terms of the popo? What's going on right now?
Well, God only knows what's going on with Tom Brady. Although I will say Tom Brady pulled a pretty spiteful move by taking his new team to the Super Bowl. But
well, as I mentioned to you, as I mentioned to you offline, we are broadcasting technically in Providence, Rhode Island, which is technically the host city for the New England Patriots. And I don't know, some guy named Robert Kraft you might have heard of down there. He might be the most infamous person down there. We'll touch on that in a second if we can. How are the police engaging with the sex worker community right now?
So I've been on the ground here in Tampa all this week. We have a network of people who are keeping an eye on the jail rosters and the court records, and talking to people on the ground out on the strolls to see where law enforcement activity has ramped up. And when arrests are made, we go to first appearance hearings and we bail people out, which is what we have the Super Bowl bailout fund for. And, also to the point that trafficking maybe isn't the issue that it's alleged to be, is that none of the women that we have bailed out this week knew that the Super Bowl was this weekend. So, take from that what you will. But yeah, so, in their search for victims of human trafficking, law enforcement is just doing the same thing that they've always done, which is patrolling the popular strolls for sex workers, for street-based sex workers, and busting them and taking them to jail. And then they're getting held usually on between $100 and $500 bond, which we will then pay. And then we will try to kind of handhold them through the process so that they don't, jump bail and get in more trouble.
Right.
One thing that's interesting is that there's been less arrests this year so far, I mean, it's still early, than previously that are specifically charges of prostitution. And I kind of suspect that's because we have a pretty high profile throughout Florida. And we're getting folks who are getting like minor drug charges and other kind of like ancillary charges. So that feels kind of tricky to me personally, just looking at it. As far as the court system goes, from being in first appearance court all week, I can tell you that is a mess. We had 2 folks that were arrested who were immigrants. And one of them did not get her first appearance hearing for an extra day because the court couldn't find a Mandarin translator in a timely fashion. So she had to spend an additional night in jail. And who knows what's going to happen to them as far as their immigration status going forward, because prostitution being a crime of, quote, moral turpitude can impact somebody's immigration status.
Right.
It's a really good opportunity too for the cops to like sweep up anybody who might have had like a missed appearance. And in the meantime, we actually did see somebody who we thought they've got some of the red flags as someone who might be being exploited. And we talked to the victim's advocate at the courthouse and said, we have this person that we think has some of the hallmarks of someone who might be being exploited. Who should we, and this is almost a facetious question at this point because we already know how it's going to turn out, said, who should we talk to about that? And the victim's advocate said, "Oh, you need to report it to law enforcement." And it's like, I think they've had enough contact with law enforcement this week, but thank you.
Wow.
That's
Don't hurt yourself. Don't stretch. Don't go out of your way there.
Yeah, and also like what happens if these victims, quote unquote, don't want to stay sober in the program that you force them into in order for them to get housing, or people will get held on remand or on higher bail if they are experiencing homelessness. And I mean, it's a mess. It's a whole system built around criminalizing poverty.
Right. The pipeline to prison writ large. The talk to me about stings, and I want to preface this remark by what some folks who will hear this for the first time will be astonished by. There are jurisdictions in the United States where, contrary to every cop film or every cop show you've ever seen, that law enforcement, representatives of law enforcement, can engage in sexual activity with folks in the escort / adult entertainment community, and that's okay, considered okay. Is that the case in Florida? And what are some of this? How do they set up stings?
Yeah, that's a huge problem. And as far as I know, it is okay in Florida. There are some places where it's more actively encouraged and discouraged, but I don't, off the top of my head, know of any jurisdictions where it is illegal for law enforcement officers to have sexual contact or just have sex with sex workers in pursuit of a bust. And I am personally of the opinion that that is a violation of consent. So
Right.
You cannot consent in that situation. And obviously it leads to situations where people are potentially being exploited for sexual favors to get out of arrest also. Yeah, so stings will be organized. Usually it's a dedicated task force that has its own funding that is set up to imitate a customer. And they will basically prey on sex workers who are in a position where they don't feel that they have the ability to screen clients. So a lot of sex workers will screen their clients, and it is encouraged to do so, not only for their safety, but also for their legal safety. So what ends up happening is that, every once in a while, someone who screens their clients, they'll get busted just because, you can't win them all. But by and large, the women and people who get busted are those who are in a position of financial desperation enough that they aren't screening. Right. So it's another example of how the system preys on people who are really putting themselves at risk to survive.
Right. And the term for that is, in fact, survival sex. I mean, do you, and this is sort of I know the answer to this question already, but you bring about in our conversation here a moral authority and a gravitas that I can't possibly replicate. How prevalent is survival sex in a community like Central and South Florida, where by definition you get folks from around the country of lesser economic means or who are marginalized because of proximity to Central and Latin America in terms of refugee status and or immigration status in a part of the country where, quite frankly, at least superficially, it seems easier to be homeless and a lower cost of housing as opposed to, say, New England, where if the conditions this time of year for anyone who isn't properly housed is just frankly brutal. So how prevalent is that in Central and South Florida?
I mean, we haven't worked ourselves out of a job yet. Let's put it that way. There's a lot of survival sex here. And I think that, I'm originally from Washington State, and I spent a lot of time in the Seattle area. And there's a very, very, very large population of people experiencing homelessness there. And there's some pretty significant income inequality there. for very different reasons. And you kind of wouldn't think so because the weather there is awful, and being homeless in Seattle in the winter is brutal differently than the Northeast. It's very wet and terrible. But, ultimately, survival sex is everywhere. And what mitigates it, if you are I wouldn't say that I consider it to be a social ill from like a moral perspective, but I think that people being in a position where they don't feel like they have choices and they don't feel like they can make informed and safe decisions is a moral failing on the part of society. So, as is the case in Florida, there is a pretty significant lack of social safety net. And survival sex and other kinds of survival crimes like petty theft are a lot more prevalent in places that don't have, where the government isn't taking care of people in the right ways, right? The emphasis in a lot of places like Florida is law enforcement intervention as opposed to having a social safety net that enables prevention.
Cash bail is clearly a hot button now in criminal justice reform. The elimination of said cash bail. Is there any movement afoot in your jurisdiction, or even some of the jurisdictions you might work with in other parts of the country, to get rid of cash bail?
Yeah. We have a very grassroots movement around this now. We'd like to we were hoping to be able to ride the coattails of, there was a measure in California on the ballot this last cycle. Unfortunately, it didn't pass. And I definitely want to dedicate some time personally to understanding more about why, what the cons are there, because I've kind of failed to digest them when they're told to me. But just because the cash bail system seems so patently evil. So unfortunately, we weren't able to ride the coattails of that victory. But today's a new day, and we're just going to keep pushing. And one thing that's interesting about Florida is that it really is, even though it has kind of it's leaned more conservative in recent years on some of the bigger ticket races. It's pretty socially libertarian in some other ways, and even progressive. Florida recently voted to restore the voting rights of its felons, right? That was huge. And not necessarily something you would expect to see in a red state. Which I say without the intention of alienating, our red listeners here, but like, you don't see a lot of those kind of socially progressive measures in places in the South. Right. Unfortunately, the bureaucracy of the state of Florida implemented some rules that made that more difficult, like some kind of back end stuff about having to have all of your court fines paid before you can restore your rights. And so that is another place that we've been trying to put resources, is paying off people's court fines. And even just finding out what your court fines are can really be a headache that people will lose patience with.
No, absolutely. Ending the I'll call it the criminalization of civil fines is a critical part of, if you will, lessening the impact of economic racism on marginalized communities. It's, for too many people, a late fine on a child support payment and a parking ticket that escalates and becomes criminal. What folks who've never been poor don't understand, that it's really expensive to be poor. And what I mean by that, and I'm not trying to be flippant at all, it's deadly serious, is that the nickel and diming that you get with fees and exorbitant interest costs, very often, which are a function of government itself, one misstep, and if you're poor, in the eyes of the government, has incredible impact, court appearances, which are then tied in with court fines, which mean taking days off of work, which mean potentially the loss of work, which means potentially the inability to make rent payments and child support payments. And if you fail your child support payments, that can become criminalized. There are countless traps, if you will, in marginalized communities to sort of fall off that edge. I often use the term folks on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I mean that in the sense financially, and what that can mean to that pipeline to prison is it's just a quick descent into it. It's you get your license suspended. That seems to be the gateway to jail, because if you get pulled over with your license being suspended in most jurisdictions, you're going to jail.
Yeah, I mean, at best, if you get pulled over for a suspended license, at the very best, you just can't drive away in your car, right? Like
Right.
That actually happened to me some years ago. I had a ticket that I didn't even know about. It was a speeding ticket from a couple of years ago that I thought I paid, and I happened to be driving with a friend and got pulled over for like a taillight. And they're like, "Ma'am, your license is suspended." And I was like, "What the, really? Oh my God." And they said, "Yeah. So, you're going to need to switch seats if your friend is a licensed driver." And they let us go along our way. But that was in Washington State. I don't think it would be the same in Florida.
Or in the Bronx.
Yeah, or in the Bronx. And, the best case scenario there, if I had been alone, would be that I had to leave my car on the side of the road and walk somewhere, get a cab somewhere, find somebody I knew who was licensed to come get my vehicle. Maybe my vehicle gets towed. Maybe they just give you another ticket if they don't take you away to jail, but you couldn't pay the first ticket. So how the hell are you going to pay this second ticket? And then you have to make an appearance. There's even some stuff like I think it was New York. If you let your car insurance lapse, they take away your license plates for 90 days.
Yep. They showed them.
And then how are you supposed to? Yeah, you showed them. Well, sure, but how is that person going to get to work? And yeah, it's really, really fast how those things stack up, and you can spiral into a pretty desperate situation. And I don't want to categorize sex work as a crime of desperation. And for a lot of people, specifically the people who are most likely to be targeted for incarceration, the majority of what they do are acts of desperation, acts of just needing to survive, because the greater apparatus of our culture and our institutions have left them behind.
Absolutely.
So why are we arresting those people for prostitution?
Well, you talk about culture, the popular culture. Les Mis, minus the soundtrack, is a reality for a whole lot of people, and that's here in the United States. That's not some underdeveloped nation. That's not some third world nation. That's not in a handful of impoverished cities, but it's literally everywhere at this point. And I just we only got a couple of minutes left, but I just we haven't even had a chance, and it's probably a conversation for another night because I want to finish up on the Super Bowl. But the impact of COVID, if you will, on folks who are relying on sex work literally to feed their families, engaging in survival sex, the explosion of OnlyFans, and what and organizations like that have become, by many accounts, grotesquely oversaturated with high fees going to the providers. This is all a function, I believe, of legislation like FOSTA-SESTA, which does not empower people to fight trafficking, but if it's a word, depowers, if you will, away the rights and the abilities of individuals to stand up on their own, using their body in a manner that they choose to, for any one of a number of reasons. Yet at the same time, to me, the final irony of the Super Bowl is that while an inordinate amount of law enforcement will be utilized to arrest, to criminalize, to take off the streets trans folk, some men and women who are using their bodies to support themselves economically, we are simultaneously going to be watching the entire nation, in fact, the entire planet by some accords, is going to be watching an event which is a group of highly paid individuals using their bodies very often, whether it be concussions or outright, any one of a number of things, outright destroying their bodies in a similar manner alleged of sex workers. I find that I'll call that the irony of the evening. We celebrate on one hand, we diminish on the other. I don't know.
Yeah. It's incredibly illustrative, I think, of where we are at. And I think that regardless of where it's coming from, like, we hate the poor in this country. We have decided that being impoverished is a moral failing, and then have made a point of stripping down the social safety net in such a way that people who are poor cannot become unpoor, cannot be elevated, and then decided to put those people in jail, where then their labor is further exploited by the state. And that's where we're at with that.
Yeah, and fortunately for a whole group of people, throwing a basketball or catching a football is not included in that. For whatever reason, their skills or their choices made the cut, and they get to live happily ever after. Where just very often in some of these stadium complexes, immediately outside or within just blocks are some of the most incredible deprivation known in this country. I'd like to engage as we kind of sign off for the night in what I call shameless self-promotion. You folks are doing everything you can raise money to support bail, cash bail. How can folks contribute? How can they, instead of just talking the talk, how can they, sacrifice a little bit, even in these challenge times? It's difficult to ask money from people these times because a lot of people are quietly they're suffering in ways that many of us can't even imagine, with failing businesses that have been closed, with jobs that have been lost, extensive medical bills realized as a part of this plague. But if people are in a position to donate, how can they donate to your organization? Because I'll just say this, I've been doing this show for about 8 or 9 years, and I've had an incredible range of organizations on my show, all attempting to do, fundamental good. Your organization is amongst a handful that are so noble, so without personal benefit, if you will, in the sense of what you're doing monetarily, so self-sacrificing that I still find it astonishing. Number one, that there's a need for your work, and the fact that you folks do this work so effectively, given the resources, especially that you're given. So I just want you to know that I hold you guys in the highest regard, because of all of that and more, things that I can't even give voice to. So as a result, I would just ask people, and I'm going to ask people, how can they give you money? How can they send you money? And what will you use it for?
Well, first of all, thank you. I really appreciate that. So swapbehindbars.org is where you can find us. swapbehindbars.org/donate is where you can donate to us. You spend a little time on the webpage, browsing the tabs. There's some fuller information about the Super Bowl bailout. And it's not just about the week of the Super Bowl. It's about providing post-release resources. So even if, you're waiting on a check this week and you want to throw $5 at us next week, it's still going to be going into that same pot of trying to connect folks to decent legal representation. One of the things that we like to do is house, if we can't find them housing, because housing's really tight, we try to house some of the folks who we've bailed out until their follow-up hearings, so that they don't put themselves in further legal hot water by running or forgetting, not having, access to their records. So, anything helps. I mean, hey, I was at Target today and I got a t-shirt for $5, and there's $5 we can, $5 what you can spare. It's $5 we can use to buy somebody a t-shirt or a pair of shoes, because as we've noticed, people never seem to come out of jail with shoes. I don't know what they do with people's shoes in there. Anyway, but yeah, swapbehindbars.org/donate.
And then you have your own podcast for the organization, All in a Day's Sex Work. Where can folks find that, and where can they listen to that?
They can find All in a Day's Sex Work on any of the podcast platforms, whichever one you employ, Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, all those guys. And yeah, we're a news, politics, and features show specific to the sex industry.
Excellent. Well, Blair is with the SWOP, the Sex Worker Outreach Project. It's a nationwide set of organizations. She is specifically involved with SWOP Behind Bars. It's based in Florida, but ultimately supports folks who have been incarcerated around the country, and I'm even starting to see things around the world. It's if in fact you consider yourself, just going to go on the side here for a second, if in fact you consider yourself Christ-like or trying to be Christ-like, if in fact you consider yourself a Christian, this organization deserves your support on a whole different level. And so I would ask everyone within the sound of this voice, or hears this now or into the future, to take a moment, contemplate the challenges that folks face around this country, and as we like to say, our hashtag is take it personally. Donate, support, engage, volunteer. I'm astonished when I hear people saying they're bored. Blair, I don't get the sense that you're ever bored. I haven't been able to be bored since I think 1976. There is so much to be done, isn't there?
Yes, there is. Yeah, it never stops.
Excellent.
But then what would we do with ourselves?
Sleep. Glorious sleep.
Oh, yeah.
Someday I will sleep. Let me close on this then. We are the Coalition, loud and proud. As always, we are outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network, at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, our original mothership, coalitionradio.us. Folks, we're going to sign off tonight. Have a wonderful evening, but continue, as we say, hashtag take it personally. Good night.